Hi everyone, Dr. Palmer here. Welcome to another lecture involving global perspectives. So today we'll be talking about globalization and how the voyages of 1492 by Cristobal Colon, aka Christopher Columbus, changed the face of the earth, changed ecologies and economies and peoplescapes. As always, I've provided a list of vocabulary that you will encounter throughout this lecture. The order as it appears here is strictly alphabetical, so it is not chronological, and it will not sync up with how they appear in the lecture. But please look out for these terms and names of people, because they are key points in the globalization story. So I have two questions for you to consider as you listen to this lecture. The first is, how did the events of 1493 and beyond change the world? The second question is, think about everything you consume and encounter on a daily basis. How is it a direct or indirect result of globalization? Hopefully, through this lecture, you'll be able to answer these questions, as well as by looking at your own life. Let's go on. A changing world. The way we know the Earth to be and the permanent arrangement of the continents gives us humans a false sense of security that life and the planet are unchanging. However, for millions of years, the planet underwent numerous eras of shifting chemistries, biologies, and topographies. From basic geology and the study of fossils, we know that the Earth and its landmasses diverged and converged over millions of years. The Earth is covered by large plates that shift, contract, and expand beneath our feet and have been active since the formation of the planet. This plate tectonics theory, which was proposed in the early to mid 20th century, was built from the continental drift theory proposed in the 16th century. Plate tectonics and the continental drift theory shows the way mountains and trenches in the ocean's floor form. We are reminded of this shifting plates fact when we feel or suffer the adverse effects of an earthquake or a volcano. The video to the left bottom of the screen shows how the tectonic theory would play out in the future. As you can see, Australia moves closer to Asia and actually slams into New Zealand. The continents in what's known as the Old World converge tightly. And it ends with North and South America jutting towards Africa and finding its home in what is called Pangaea Ultima. So 225 million years ago, long before humans walked the earth, the continents and nations that we recognize today were once one large landmass called Pangaea, as is seen in the continental drift of plates upper left quadrant. The map by Massimo Petrobon, up at the very top right of the screen, shows us Pangaea, the supercontinent, in the context with all the named and known places on the globe. At around 100 million years ago is when our Earth finally began to resemble the continents as we know them today. But as the video that we just watched shows, the continental drift and the shifting of the plates is a continuous process that will one day render our continents that we know irrecognizable. So let's see some other ways at how the globe has changed. So some of the ways that we also know about the continents being connected was the fact that there are certain flora and fauna, or plants and animals, that resemble each other on various continents despite them now being disconnected. Examining their proximity to each other and the time taken to disconnect certain land masses over time allowed some places to have more unique creatures. For instance, Australia has a unique set of marsupials, and the platypus, being a mammal that lays eggs and also glows in the dark, shows for how long and how distant the Australian landmass was from their other landmass, brothers and sisters, if you will. Based on the current assumptions of biographers, the occurrence of similar organisms is different in different biogeographical realms does not have to be attributed to separate creative acts of God. Instead, if you prescribe to the idea of continental drift, following the appearance of a species at a common center of origin through the creative act of God. So in looking at these flora and fauna, we can see elephants in Africa, and looking at the archaeological record, we had woolly mammoths in America. Skunks and polecats and ferrets are seen all over the New and Old Worlds. Elk and bear of the Northern America and European continents abound. Porcupines are in North America as well as Africa. Primates and monkeys are all over Africa and South America, but not in North America or Europe. And then the presence of gourds, which is independent from human activity on each continent, as well as certain lichens and mosses that are very peculiar to specific growing regions and climates, have been found on the coast, on the Atlantic coast of Africa and the Atlantic coast of the South American continent, which shows how they were interconnected at one point in time. Let's go on. Of course, human beings are the one species that colonized all of the continents. However, human beings, also known as Homo sapiens sapien, have only existed in our current form that we're familiar with today from about 200,000 to 300,000 years before present. According to American Anthropological Association, human evolution is an ongoing process. Our species remains subject to evolutionary mechanisms, including natural selection and non-Darwinian evolution. This consensus is derived from functional anatomical studies, as well as discoveries in medicine and medical anthropology. Not only have human beings developed over time, both physiologically and mentally, but also culturally. And while some were more isolated and able to develop in isolated communities, others were more intercultural. And so let's see how the both isolation and communication or convergence of these two separate but equal individual groupings came together. Old World versus New World. Prior to Christopher Columbus's voyage to the Americas, there was little contact between people of the Eastern and Western hemispheres. Now, when I talk about Eastern and Western hemispheres, I'm speaking about Old and New World. So if we consider the Old World being everything on the right of the map, and as you can see in this map, that would include Eurasia, the Middle East, and Africa, the whole continent of Africa. Those on the left-hand map, North America and South America, would for these purposes be considered the eastern part. Thus, people, plants, and animals develop their own cultures and ecology based on their proximity and relationships between people in different parts of the world. For much of humankind's existence, the two hemispheres were relatively isolated. Journeys between Scandinavia, North America, and Asia and North America were few and far between. Thus, the Aztec, Incan, Mayan, Cahokia, Zuni, and Moche empires were able to flourish in their own rights, just as the empires in Asia and Africa. Europe really didn't have big global empires until the 16th century, because before that, the Old World was dominated by the Arab merchants and the Asian dynasties and empires that held a lot of the riches. And then you have the African kingdoms, which were very rich, but also very isolated. So Columbus's voyage that landed in Hispaniola, or what we now know as the Dominican Republic, began a domino effect that changed that isolation forever. So let's move on to see exactly how that changed things. First off, a little bit of history about the place that Christopher Columbus landed upon. So Hispaniola, what came to be known as Hispaniola by Columbus, was also known as Quisqueya or Haiti at the time of the Tainos inhabiting it. So Quisqueya means the mother of all land masses in Taino language, and Haiti means land of tall mountains. So the Dominican Republic actually has the largest mountain and tallest mountain range in the Caribbean. And you can see on the map on the upper left image, right in the center is are the mountains and the mountain range. That is actually quite a big tourist event or a tourist attraction. So anyway, Taino communities were the majority of the people that lived on the island, as well as various islands throughout the Caribbean. And they did have some established centers in or on the South American continent. Their communities ranged from small settlements of about 60 people to larger centers of about 3,000 people. According to the Smithsonian Magazine article written in October 2011, Taino people may have numbered up to 2 million people at the time of Christopher Columbus coming, and almost 3 million at the end of the 15th century. Charles C. Mann, who wrote 1493, actually places the population at between 60,000 human beings to 8 million. When Columbus arrived, he was super surprised at the friendliness and civility of the Taino people, so much to say that he wrote down, "They will," quote, "they will give all they do possess for anything that is given to them, exchanging things even for bits of broken crockery." They were very well built, he states on his encounter with Taino in the Bahamas in 1492. He goes on to say, "With very handsome bodies and very good faces. They do not carry arms or know them. They should be good servants." And as we will see in the next slide, he really did take advantage of their amicability. Of course, the Taino were good hunters of animals on land and on sea. They were noted for capturing manatee, the manatee that we see as a kind of poster child for endangered species. It's friendly, it's smiley, it's kind of big, and it moves slow, and it looks like it always has a happy face on. That was one of their main sources of food. And they moved skillfully through the Caribbean archipelago. I'm talking about the Taino and not necessarily the manatee, although the manatee did, kind of have a wide range. The Taino did a lot of island hopping through their use of hollowed out trees that were manufactured into canoes. They traded with their neighbors, and they ruled through hereditary matrilineal leadership tribes. And they had well-developed pantheon of gods to which they owed their favor for their spiritual as well as their language and aesthetics. Culture clash. So we know that Columbus set out to claim a new way to the Asian markets that cut out the Arab Empire's middlemen. They sought the riches of the Orient, so the Indian and Asian empires, silks, fine stones, sapphires, rubies, as well as porcelain and other things that were produced in Asia. So when Columbus proposed the revolutionary idea that the earth was round and he would be able to get to Asia by traveling west, it took a while for him to get a patron. However, he finally found in King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella that they were willing to take that risk, and so they gave him ships, or they gave him money to purchase ships and cargo, and he sailed west in the hopes of getting to the east. Instead, however, what the voyage encountered was the island that they would call Hispaniola, after the empire that backed their voyage. The first settlement in what we now know as the Dominican Republic, they named Navidad because they had arrived there around Christmas time in 1492. The settlement ended up failing when Columbus went back to Spain to tell of his voyage and all the things he found. When he returned, Navidad had ended. And so they established a second settlement called La Isabela after the Spanish queen. And Charles C. Mann in 1493 argues that La Isabela became the site of the modern Caribbean landscape based on the number of intentional and unintentional biological exchanges. Interestingly enough, much of what we know about La Isabela has been retrieved through Indiana University's Bloomington expeditions and research trips. So the people that Columbus had encountered, they were well built and they were relatively peaceful because being on an island, they didn't have to compete with any other people. So with that, when Columbus arrived with his men, they brutally enslaved and tortured the Taínos to extract riches that Columbus had promised to the Spanish crown. In the words of Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish monk of the Dominican order who detailed the atrocities and published the abuses, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were appalled with the practices detailed in de las Casas accounts, and instead of enslaving and gathering riches, they switched their interest to saving and winning the souls of the native Taínos for the Catholic Church. So back to La Isabela, of the site of biological kind of mayhem, not only was it the Spaniards who were the invasives that would change the face of the Caribbean biologies, but it was also the things that the unintended flora and fauna that changed the structure of the soil. For instance, earthworms and dandelions being transported unwittingly. The pollination of plants, bringing honeybees and mosquitoes to the hemisphere, the New World. And then the spread of disease with mosquitoes and rats, bringing all manners of bubonic plague, hantavirus with rats, mosquitoes and malaria, as well as dengue fever, yellow fever. And all of these things displaced the original inhabitants to create a new era, the era of globalization. So let's look and see what else these voyages changed. Charles C. Mann states that Columbus reknit the seams of Pangaea. His actions re-established direct contact between the old and new worlds, or East and the Western hemispheres. It caused what Charles C. Mann calls biological mayhem, which led to Homogene, the age where biologies and ecologies around the world came to resemble each other based on similar flora and fauna present. The phenomena occurred over hundreds of years where invasive species that lacked their indigenous counterpart predators flourished beyond all controls in their new habitat. Thus began a replacement of indigenous plants and animals for the foreign plants and animals. For instance, there are many plants in the Americas, such as the honeysuckle, that resemble those in Asia, but they have been separated for so long that they and the birds and animals that rely on them evolved and adapted to their unique ecologies. So they develop unique nutritional values in their berries, let's say, and the animals and birds that eat them developed simultaneously with them in order to eat those berries, and let's say if there were nuts that would give them the best amount of nutrition. So when the honeysuckle from Asia was introduced in North America, it grew faster than their native plants, and the Asian honeysuckle soon replaced it. And even though it produced berries, just like the American version, because it didn't have the same chemical and nutritional values of the indigenous plants, the native indigenous songbirds that relied on the American honeysuckle for its highly specified nutritional balance that the native berries had, and all of a sudden they're eating the foreign berries, like they don't know the difference. They're little birds. They didn't get the same nutrition, and they perish because they're not able to sustain themselves with the nutrition that they're getting. This is actually still a big problem, and it continues throughout the ecologies of not only the Americas, but also in Europe and Asia and Africa as well. However, since we're focusing on the New World and the changes, we're going to talk mostly about the changes in the New World. So with the exchange, human types, the culprit for replacing and mixing was disease. Diseases like smallpox, yellow fever, malaria, and others rendered ruin to indigenous peoples, including the remaining Taino in the Caribbean. According to Charles C. Mann, less than 500 Taino were alive past 1558, which was roughly 50 years after Columbus arrived on the island. And it was because of the introduced viruses and bacteria that weakened the life force of the Taino, but it was also the cultural practices that the Spanish had introduced that decimated the Taino. Forced slavery, torture, and displacement, and as well as oppression, continued their existence to be rendered obsolete in much of their homelands. Although Mann and others claim that there were very few Tainos that survived the Spanish colonization of Hispaniola and the Caribbean, the fact that Taino culture exists today is very clear when you visit certain very rural places within the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. The fact that they retain elements of their Taino culture, including linguistic features, agricultural practices, foodways, medicine, fishing practices, technology and architecture, as well as the stories they pass on and the religious views of these people, shows how the Taino live on. Today, in our American culture, Taino culture and language still is present. So the idea of a barbecue, and the word barbecue, the word canoe, the sea-going or water-going vessel of the canoe is Taino. The word hurricane, which we see in the Caribbean all the time, is something that the Taino suffered both before Columbus and after Columbus, which it makes sense for us to incorporate it into our English lexicon. Hammock, the word, and the woven bed that kind of hangs outside is a remnant of Taino culture, and as well as the ball game of soccer, the world's most favorite game. There are ball courts all over, not only the Caribbean, but the Caribbean islands, but the Caribbean South America. And also you have popular culture, which attempts to reinvigorate old archetypes, both Taino and the mixed heritage of the Caribbean today. So one example of kind of like a reinvigoration of a folk hero and trying to make a folk hero is the art of Edgardo Miranda Rodriguez, and he creates a world for representation with his character La Boriqueña. He says, quote, La Boriqueña's presence in mainstream media shines a light on Puerto Rico, an island nation that is the world's oldest colony at 122 years. Puerto Rico is a colony with 3 million second-class U.S. citizens that cannot vote for president this November. And when he was talking about this November, he was talking about the 2020 election. He goes on to state, quote, I wanted to create a character that stood for environmental justice, social justice, and was connected to the feminine power in Puerto Rico. So his protagonist, La Boriqueña, is of Afro-Taino roots, and as he mentioned, she is an environmental and social justice warrior. So a lot of his stories take place with helping the oppressed within the New World. So yes, the island of Hispaniola was taken over mostly by Spanish people with the introduction of African slaves. However, the Taino did continue to live on. But in order to establish a relationship with Spain, which up until recently was very lucrative, the Dominican Republic, in relation to this history, in the middle 20th century, decided to create a monument to Colón, or Christopher Columbus. And so they created this Faro de Colón, which Charles C. Mann goes into great detail about the controversy of this monument. So the monument was representative to Christopher Columbus and how great a man he was because he discovered America. Well, he didn't really discover America because there were already people here. However, what he did was open Pandora's box, where just the worms and the bees and the mosquitoes and the rats came out and pretty much changed the habitat for indigenous flora, fauna, and human beings. But what this monument also did was it was a symbol of ego, because the president at the time, Trujillo, was bent on extracting Haitian people who are predominantly of African descent, extracting them and committing genocide on those peoples. The word parsley, perejil, was an indicator whether somebody was Dominican or whether they were Haitian. If they pronounced it in the Haitian way, they were killed during this reign of Trujillo. So part of the reason he was trying to extract and extinguish the Haitian connection, the other half of the island of Hispaniola, or Quisqueya, was because even though Trujillo was of mixed descent and probably had some Taino in him, he was of the mindset of white supremacy, that white is right, and everything that is good is in Europe. And so building this massive Faro de Colón, monument to this great man, was something that he should do. And so it is in the form of a cross, because Columbus brought not only the Spanish and the unknowing travelers, but it also brought Christianity. And so these are the steps that lead up. And again, this is another tourist attraction that people can go to. And it's very ornate. It's actually quite a very beautiful, amazing building set in a beautiful tropical island. And supposedly it holds the bone, I believe it's a finger bone, of Christopher Columbus. So, however, in 2011, I believe, when they tried to when scientists try to go in and do some DNA testing to see if it really was Christopher Columbus's bone, there was all of a sudden this red tape that they couldn't get through, and so they were never able to really confirm or deny whether the bone was Christopher Columbus's. So it's still there, and so is the Faro de Colón. And so the reason why Charles C. Mann brings Faro de Colón up in his book is to talk about the two contrasting kind of archipelagos, stories within history. So you have the Caribbean archipelago and the island of Hispaniola and Christopher Columbus, which, it opened the door to Old World meets New World. However, in our studies of American history and global studies, global perspectives, we don't really hear too much about the Philippines. And Charles C. Mann argues that it was the Philippines and those leaders within the maritime and economics that actually created more of a connection, a continuous connection between the East and the West, and the North and the South. And that's where things really began to change. And so even though the Philippines and the people that landed there do not receive the same treatment as Christopher Columbus, it is important to note that the Philippines is strategically located between the East and West hemispheres. The Philippines was already a prime site of trade within Asia itself, but also became a prime site of opening trade between Europe and the Ming Dynasty that ruled China. Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese explorer, led a fleet for Spain and marked the beginning of the Spanish colonization that began in full in 1565 with the arrival of Miguel Lopez de Legazpi and Andre Ochoa de Odentana y Sare. And we'll find out more about these guys in the next slide. So join me. So although Charles C. Mann complains that Legazpi and Odenta y Saren do not get their fair share of the fanfare in American history, in the Philippines, held every July, is the Sanduago Festival. In Tagbilaran City, Charter Day, which starts on July 1st, and it kicks off a month-long festival with a holy mass, a motorcade, and a program sponsored by the city government. Among the major activities during the month is the Miss Bohol Sanduago beauty pageant and the Sanduago street dancing. competition, which is usually held on the third or fourth Sunday in July and organized by Bohol Sanduago Foundation. So there is a rising of the cross, which is seen on the left-hand side in the bottom left picture, which kind of, it's a reenactment of Legazpi's voyage to the Philippines and his arrival. Mann notes that Legazpi and Udanta y Serene, they established continual trade with China by sailing west. And it was European, or Spanish specifically, their access to New World silver that drew a trade relationship between Spain and Asia. The silver actually became Chinese monetary units. And although China kept out Europeans and their biology, other biologies entered and wreaked havoc on the landscape. So sweet potatoes that had come from America and maize opened new lands for China to produce agriculture. Population increased, deforestation, and shifting powers. We'll get back to that in a moment, but let's go on to South America and talk about silver. So the now small town of Potasi in Bolivia was the biggest city in South America in 1642, and it was second only to Mexico City. It soon became the primary sponsor for the Spanish monarchy, and it became a vehicle to China's dependency on silver, which opened trade with the West. China's increased insatiable demand led to smuggling, counterfeiting, and environmental upheaval, which Mann goes into further details in his following chapters of 1493. What's important to know is that Potasi mines are still active. According to environmentaljustice.org, estimates that from the 16th century, when the Spanish first arrived, more than 8 million miners died due to accidents or diseases caused by exposure to toxic substances when mining silver and gold. The mostly unregulated mining now threatens the actual integrity of the mountain itself, from which the precious metal resources have been extracted. The mountain collapsing now threatens the entire town and shows how human activity can affect the landscape with possible environmental and ecological ramifications. Global human activity and climate change. So climate change has been in the news for quite some time now, and it makes headlines all over, whether it's print, online, or on the television or radio. However, human beings have been affecting and effecting the global climate for eons. Through the integration of archaeological data with stable isotopes, ancient DNA, and analysis of climate and environmental productivity, this data provides perspectives of a variety of human activity as related to each other. Archaeological research and computation modeling can document the effects of drought on agriculture, for which studies in China and the American Southwest were conducted. Rick and Sandweiss in 2020 state, quote, debates continue about the extent and scale of past human modification of the Amazon, but past human settlement strategies and agriculture systems provide valuable insight into present and future human environmental interactions, end quote. There is increasing recognition that archaeological sites offer important proxy records of past climatic and environmental states that contribute data for testing models of future climate. Collectively, these and other studies demonstrate that archaeological sites represent a series of observation networks about changing environmental conditions and human activities through time. In a study conducted by Dr. Pongras that was published in the Holocene 2011, Dr. Pongras compiled a model of global land beginning over an 800 current era, or CE. What she found when looking at 4 historical events closely, she theorized these 4 events could have impacted the climate due to the return of forests after depopulation. The events she looked at was the Black Death in Europe at the end of the 14th century, the fall of the China's Ming Dynasty in the last half of the 17th century, the conquest of the Americas in the 16th and 17th century, and finally the Mongolian invasion of 13th to 14th centuries. Quote, we found that during the short events such as the Black Death and the Ming Dynasty collapse, the forest regrowth wasn't enough to overcome the emissions from decaying material in the soil, end quote. Dr. Pongras goes on to say, quote, but during the longer lasting ones like Mongol invasion and conquest of the Americas, there was enough time for the forest to regrow and absorb significant amounts of carbon. So in a sense, as seen by this map at the top, which shows the extent of the Mongolian Empire reaching from the China Sea all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, the depopulation of the area allowed forests to come back, people to consume less energy, and the forest to consume the excess carbon, which allowed a cooling of the global atmosphere. This theory places human activity as the preliminary cause for climate change. Conversely, climate change is argued to have led to a number of human groups to proliferate and empires to rise, again back to the Mongolian Empire. A number of climatologists, historians, and archaeologists agree that the rise of the Mongol Empire in the 13th century Common Era was directly impacted by climate and the environment. Some studies, such as one featured in Nature, noted that increased rainfall on the usually arid steppes increased grass growth, which allowed more horses to be grazed, the herds to be increased, an increase in agricultural land available, population growth, and specialization to support centralized government under Genghis Khan or Chinggis Khan, and an increased army with increased stamina to travel further. One article I read, it stated that each Mongolian horseman would actually have to have 5 horses to support that one soldier. So that's a lot of horses, and a significant amount of rainfall, which would increase the grass, would allow those numbers of both animals and people to specialize. When we look at the rise and fall of empires and nations, the map right there, we can see Egypt and various empires have their peak heights during the energy output, the increased energy output of the sun. So when the sun's energy is high, great nations are able and cultures are able to flourish. When we look at areas in the Western Africa, like the Edo Kingdom, we see how large communities and cultures become and their cultural practices can have an effect on their microclimate, but again, how these microclimates can enlarge it. So when we talk about smelting, iron smelting, so the producing iron, the earliest known iron workers in sub-Saharan Africa is believed to be located in central Nigeria at the site of Torka, and the advanced iron technology existed as early as 0th century Common Era, so right at the beginning. And archaeological excavations at Toraka uncovered wrought iron objects, quantities of slag, and over a dozen furnaces, as well as domestic pottery and terracotta figurines. By the end of the first millennia before Common Era, iron was used and ironworking was spread out through Nigeria in the northern savannah by the 1st or 2nd century. And it also spread down into the forested areas. So by the 13th and 14th centuries, iron smelting was well established in the Benin court or the Edo Empire. And with the amount of iron that people smelted, not only for weapons, but also for art, and to commemorate their leaders, that requires a lot of heat, a lot of fuel, and so what actually ended up happening was deforestation, because the great Edo Empire needed to cut down trees to burn and create charcoal so that it could burn and create, so that they could do their iron smelting. So this actually helped lead to a desertification of the Western Africa or Central African region. That sort of coincided the Western Desert with the Eastern Desert, which had been developing during the heavy agricultural Egyptian dynasties. So if we look back to archaeology, and we come across archaeological excavations and that show us how human existence might not have always been how we see it today. So in looking at pictographs in Egypt and across the Sahara, we see that they tell very different stories than the stories that we see playing out now. Quote, "We now know that these images document a dramatic climate change across North Africa from the hyper-arid desert it is today to a nearly completely vegetated landscape dotted with large and small lakes during the early and middle Holocene epoch. This event is commonly called the African Human Period." The African Human Period was a direct result of African monsoonal climate variations or responses to periodic variations in the Earth's orbit around the sun. And then they occur roughly every 20,000 years. Impressively, the African humid period is just the most recent of hundreds of earlier humid events, spanning as far back as the Miocene era or epoch 9 million years ago, and likely much earlier as well. So human evidence in West Africa and Northern Africa show that there was a lot of grazing. There are fossils of sea and water living creatures in land that is in the middle of the desert. So it just goes to show that human activity, whether it be smelting or heavy agriculture or an industrial revolution, can have massive effects on our climate as well as our ecosystems. Returning back to North America and the United States, Charles C. Mann talked about how indigenous people used fire to manage landscapes for their agricultural purposes. Fire not only removed the thorny underbrush for farming, but it controlled noxious insects and added nutrients to the soils. It also opened up grazing lands for the animals that they hunted. Members of indigenous nations that we now come to think of as being part of horse culture prior to the Spanish reintroducing the horse to North American continent, cultivated lands. These massive fires that the groups of people created in preparation for their corn, beans, and squash, also known as the Three Sisters, as well as other vegetable and foodstuffs, changed weather patterns. So some of the indigenous people that participated in the use of agroforestry and pyro management, so just managing forest through fire, were the Cadones in Red River drainage, Wichita people along Arkansas River, Pawnee and Kansas River, and the Platte River drainages, the Rikara, Mandan, and Hidatsa nations that live along the Missouri River and in the Dakotas, and now they live in also parts of Wisconsin today. And then there were other people who were pushed onto the Great Plains in the late prehistoric and protohistoric times, such as the Lakota and the Cheyenne, who, like Mann discussed, they gave up some of their agricultural prowess to take up nomadic and raiding hunter lifestyles. And a few of these other groups decided to do both, hunt and be semi-nomadic, whereby still producing crops during the summer months. So with the coming of Europeans and the decimation of native communities and cultural practices, fires were stamped. This meant less fire, more trees could grow, less people, less energy going out. And Robert A. Dull, who is cited in 1493, who is a University of Texas professor, cited that reforestation of the tropical regions in the Americas could have led to a quarter drop in temperature of the Earth's temperature, which is quite significant. The number of Old World, New World exchanges is numerous and continuous, as we are still a world that trades globally, We consume globally, we produce globally. But a few that are important should be mentioned. Diseases like yellow fever, syphilis, and smallpox wreaked havoc on indigenous people. The development of chattel slavery replaced African people on sites of both North and South America and Central America. And it also, the African phenotype and genotype actually allowed for a more diverse creolization of human populace to develop within South America, Central America, and the Caribbean mostly. Interestingly enough, Mexico City became the first real cosmopolitan city of the world, where you had native peoples, peoples from Africa, and peoples from Asia and Europe all combining and interacting in one space. They were of various classes, powers, and health, but that was the first place of not only material wealth, global material wealth, but also genetic material wealth. The amount of mixing of human beings that was encountered in Latin America actually spurred people to do studies and create art based on the mixing of human types. So, for instance, a European and an African parents combining to create an offspring would create a mulatto, which actually means, it's kind of dehumanizing, but it means a small mule, and mules are a combination of a donkey and a horse, and thus rendered most commonly unable to reproduce. So they are barren, and thus it was possibly thought that because, people of African descent and people of European descent are so different that they could only procreate once, and that would be the end of the line. On the other hand, an African and a indigenous person would create a Zorro, and a Zorro means a fox. So possibly those two people of color combining, maybe it was thought that they would be witty and sly like a fox. So there are many different classifications or razas that are listed here. You can have a mulatto combine it with a Zorro, and that would create another classification of human beings. But anyway, so this idea of a new world experiment really started in Mexico City. We think, being Americans, it started in North America, but according to Charles C. Mann, that's not true. Finally, Old New World exchanges, we see power shifts in the Chinese empires from the Ming Dynasty to the Qing Dynasty. So when Christopher Columbus, or Cristobal Colon, founded La Isabela, the world's most populous cities were clustered in a band in the tropics, all but one of which were 30 degrees from the equator. at the top of the list was Beijing. It was the exception. And Charles C. Mann argues that this culture clash between the Old World and New World, when they came together, it flipped the whole power dynamics from the Southern Hemisphere having most of the wealth because they had most of the resources. That's where the agriculture could develop. That's where a lot of the gold and silver lay. And then through this culture contact, which was set off by Christopher Columbus, it flipped everything upside down. So all of the wealth that had been building up and up and up, we can see in this map 2,000 years of economic history in one chart. So we can see how at the start of the millennia, we have China and India have the most wealth, and then the Middle East has a good portion of wealth as well. And Europe and the Americas didn't really have too much going on, but as time progressed, the Asian wealth kind of waned and European wealth rose. And of course, the United States was a fairly recent invention, and so our wealth grew exponentially. So yeah, and it became not a matter of how people you have on your land, how many resources you have, how much agriculture can support those people. Rather, it became how much can we extract from other places and then manufacture and then flip it and send it back to those other places, which is what mercantilism and imperialism and colonization really spurred. So in conclusion, 1493 heralded a new era that connected the East and Western worlds, the North and the Southern Hemisphere. Culture contact, beginning with Christopher Columbus, and the Taínos set off a biological time bomb that moved towards homogenizing, what man calls a homogenization of biological ecologies. Centers of power were in tropical zones up until the 1600s, when the trend in wealth distribution moved from predominantly in the Southern Hemisphere to the Northern Hemisphere, and that trend continues today. Miguel Lopez de Legazpi and Andres Ochoa de Odenta y Septin initiated an open trade between Europe and China, because up until then, China didn't want anything that Europe had. Europe was in barbarous dark ages. So ironically, when Europeans were calling Asians barbarians, they were doing the same thing. But then they've got to taste the silver, and it all changed. And then finally, our globalized world comes with more predictability, efficiency, control, and calculability, but the irrationality of rationality renders a dehumanization, a culture clash, and evolves how we deal with change. Thank you everyone for listening, and I hope you go out and take a few moments to really think about how your environment, the things you consume, is related to this idea of globalization. Thanks, and have a wonderful day or evening, depending on when you watch this.